The Persona series has gotten a lot of traction over the years, ever since the series hit the mainstream gaming audiences with entries like Persona 4 and Persona 5. What used to be a spin-off for the Shin Megami Tensei series has taken a whole life on its own, and may have even surpassed the original work it was based on. With this huge boost in popularity, it does make sense for ATLUS to try and capitalize on this ever-growing popularity by giving us more Persona adventures in the way of spin-offs. Which is sort of strange, don't you think? A spin-off of a spin-off series. Anyway, the question here is, aren't there a bit too many Persona spin-offs? Now we know that they're probably hard at work developing the next game in the series, but how can one really milk a franchise before fans start clamoring for the next installment in the Persona franchise? We mentioned in our review of Persona 5 Tactica, which you should check out by the way, that there were quite a bit too much Persona spin-offs. Wait, how many Persona spin-offs have there been? There was a dancing one and also a fighting game, and one that kinda went Warriors Hack and Slash. There's been 8 Persona spin-offs?! Now, while this seems a bit too many for a single franchise to have, it is worth mentioning that each of these shift away from the usual JRPG style game that the original titles are known for. These allow the developers of the games to branch out from the already established Persona formula and try out something new and refreshing, but at the same time, keeping the familiarity with the already existing characters and dynamics. This is also a great way to build up the world of the respective games more by giving players who really enjoyed the mainline title more of the stories and characters they've come to love. Another thing to note is that these spin-offs are more or less canon to their original game's timeline, which may get confusing for some players looking to sink their time into these. Now let's talk about the actual spin-offs and what they bring to the table. We won't be including games like Persona 4 Golden, Persona 5 Royal, and the most recent release Persona 3 Reload, as those games are still considered as mainline titles with just more content in them. We're also not including all the mobile game spin-offs save for one, as there's too many of them to list down, especially with all the mobile games that have collabed with the Persona series. The one that started the mainline spin-off trend was the release of Persona 4 Arena, a fighting game sequel to the mainline Persona 4. This game takes the familiar Persona formula and transfers it into a high-octane fighting game. Aside from being just a spin-off, the game was a really well-made fighting game and was also able to incorporate the different aspects of the Persona 4 crew, as well as introduce new and returning characters to really buff up the roster of fighters. Each of the fighters all played differently from each other, and picking your favorite was a tough choice considering the amount of playable characters in the game. The main standout of this spin-off was the story and how they managed to introduce some of the Persona 3 cast, who are a lot more experienced and wiser from their years of fighting shadows. It was here that players saw the potential of these spin-offs, as we are given a taste of the two mainline Persona casts actually getting to meet and interact with each other. No longer were the "what if this P3 character met this P4 character" a thing of the imagination. Chie meeting Akihiko, anyone?
If you can't even tell the dishes apart, you have no right to steal my meat.
What? Excuse me? This is from Aya. How would I mistake it from somewhere else?
The feeling we get from seeing these characters interact is like when you introduce two of your friends to each other and they hit it off pretty well. That feeling of satisfaction is one of the main standouts in this spin-off. While we're on the topic of Persona 4 Arena, the game was popular enough to get a sequel with more characters added onto it, with Persona 4 Arena Ultimax. The game was so popular that it was even included in another spin-off called Blaze Blue Cross Tag Battle. Come on, they're not even limited to their own games anymore. Continuing on to the other games, there are a few more noteworthy ones like the Persona 4 Rhythm game spin-off, which in turn caused them to also release a version with the Persona 3 and Persona 5 cast. While the stories in this one can also be considered canon, it wasn't really notable enough for players to actually need to play these to get the full picture of the previous games. It is here that the devs really started to experiment with the different game genres that would fit with the already established Persona world. The most notable one, and probably the last of the Persona 4 spin-offs, is the release of Persona Q Shadow of the Labyrinth. This game shifts away from the usual anime-style designs and goes for a more chibi look for the characters. It's also another game in which the cast of Persona 3 and Persona 4 meet, but unlike the time they meet in Persona 4 Arena, they meet each other during the timelines of their respective games. Which is honestly confusing as these games are set a few years apart from each other as seen by the older P3 cast in Persona 4 Arena. As for the gameplay, Persona Q Shadow of the Labyrinth does not stray away from the franchise's JRPG turn-based roots. Actually, it's best to say that this game is even closer to its roots, as it features the dungeon crawler type gameplay that the original Persona used to have. This gives fans of the newer games a way to enjoy the older aspects of the series and actually get to experience what made the older titles great. Speaking of newer Persona titles, this game also had a sequel called Persona Q2 New Cinema Labyrinth, in which aside from the P3 and P4 cast, they finally crossed over to the Persona 5 characters too. This is like a fanfiction come to life, as seeing all these characters we've come to know and love interacting with each other was enough to make us glad that these types of games were being made. And now we move on to the more recent title, Persona 5. If you thought Persona 4 was being milked, oh boy, let me tell you about Persona 5. Persona 5 may even be more milked than the previous Persona titles, especially with all the mobile game collabs this one has. If you include Persona Q2 and the dancing game, this title already has just as many spin-offs, if not even more than the previous two games. This entry already seems to have less interactions with the older P4 and P3 cast compared to the previous spin-offs, and instead has the most collabs with other games. Persona 5's Joker even made it into Super Smash Bros. Despite being a PlayStation exclusive at the time. Talk about popularity! Persona 5 spin-offs are the ones that usually stray far from the established formula by going for a complete genre shift from the mainline game, with titles like Persona 5 Strikers and Persona 5 Tactica all trying out different gameplay genres. For us, that leap in genre is a pretty refreshing way to shake things up and give us more of the characters we've come to adore. A great example of this is the Dynasty Warrior style spin-off Persona 5 Strikers. The main draw of this title is being able to mow down hordes of shadows as your favorite Phantom Thieves. The way the game also manages to blend all the core mechanics of the main game and the heavy action-oriented warriors is quite an experience in itself. The game also picks up where the main game left off, with the thieves going on a road trip for their summer vacation. So yay! More Phantom Thieves adventures! The way the game is presented won't feel too jarring for players who have played the main game, as the presentation is still very similar. From the free roam of large city areas to even the cutscenes, one would think they're from the same game as the main game if one is not familiar with the title. But speaking of jarring, you can tell that the devs also aren't afraid to branch out with different art styles. That is the case with Persona 5 Tactica, which, just like Persona Q, goes for a more chibi-ish look for the characters. The game also tries a different type of turn-based gameplay, with it leaning more towards the tactics type gameplay, hence the name Tactica. Just like the previous spin-off, they also managed to incorporate all the major gameplay elements from the main titles and somehow not make it too out of place. We already had a lot of things to say about this game in our review of it, which you should totally check out by the way. And lastly, let's talk about the most recent Persona 5 spin-off, Persona 5 The Phantom X. While this game is not out yet, it is an entirely mobile spin-off but uses the same gameplay as the main Persona 5 title. It introduces a new team of Phantom Thieves and a new story as well. It also includes cameos from the original Persona 5 cast as playable characters too. But knowing this is a mobile game, there are gacha elements in this title where you might need to pull for the Phantom Thieves you want from the gacha. Since the game isn't really out in the West yet, it's difficult to tell if this game will actually be any good, but looking at the previous scene online, it's shaping up to be quite a fun looking game. The game will first be released in South Korea, Taiwan, and China, so fans who are looking to try it will have to wait a bit more for a global release, as there hasn't been any announcement on it yet. Any Persona fan should definitely keep an eye out for this one. So like we asked in the beginning of the video, are there too many Persona spin-offs? There are already quite a few titles under the Persona franchise, but if they are able to always shake up the formula and deliver fresh ideas using the established characters, we actually welcome these spin-offs as it gives us more adventures for our favorite characters. Seeing the devs experiment with different genres like fighting games, rhythm games, and full-on action games is great, as it gives fans of these genres a chance to experience the world of Persona. That being said, instead of another spin-off, please give us anything about Persona 6, please.